Yeah, I think the number one question was the first one that I listed. Basically, like, why did you choose France? And also, then you moved to Taiwan. You chose that as the place that you were going to start raising her.
Right.
So what made you decide on France and then Taiwan? Like...
So I am sitting here with my best girl, Melissa. This is packing night before we're going off to Europe to see my daughter. And I thought I'd make a quick video of the gift haul, the gifts I'm bringing across the ocean to her. Now, I did this about 2 years ago, you may recall. I made a video before I went to meet my daughter in Germany of all the gifts laid out on a couch. I do this partly because I think my daughter might watch the video one day and kind of vaguely remember, like, oh yeah, right, I remember having that thing when I was a kid. I didn't realize that my father gave that to me, or that my father brought that all the way from China. One trip it was going from Canada to Germany and France, and in this case, we're going from China to the south of France. So those are two very different stories. The question of where we would give birth was a huge pile of research. We worked against an amazingly long list of options that we researched primarily through Google, primarily through the internet.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, and no, it's actually significant also. We did in some cases rely on human opinions. We relied on talking to and asking people's opinions who seemed like they know what they're talking about, and that can be way more misleading than Google. But we considered having my daughter born in Taiwan, Thailand, various places in Asia. My wife's work or my work had connected us to. We considered United States and Canada, but obviously Canada, even just within Canada, there'd be many options. And then within Europe, and we looked at actually a long list of obscure and remote places, islands that are controlled as French territory, because Mac's wife is a French citizen, and some of the islands that are controlled as U.S. territory and so on. And so that was really a process. That was a brainstorming process, really starting from a blank sheet of paper. And a lot of the research was about how did the hospital system work in the given place? How did the insurance system work? But in all these places you had to research, one, what's going to happen if it's a normal, healthy birth with no problems, no complications? Two, what's going to happen if there are problems? Because then in terms of health insurance, money, cost, and even just where you're going to stay, right? Like where are you going to be living if things go wrong? And, but yeah, cost is certainly a factor. And then three, how are we going to live for the immediate period of weeks and months after the child is born? Because we were doing this as there's just two people alone in the world, no aunts and uncles involved, no parents involved, her parents not involved, my parents not involved, and so on.
I figured you had done plenty of research because you research everything. But, it's unfortunate that you went through all of that research and nevertheless had such a negative experience.
We ended up in a situation I was unhappy with, right? Yeah. But you asked two questions. The second question is why did we end up in Taiwan after that? Yeah. I mean, I got and assembled all the furniture. We moved in. We created this home to raise our daughter in Perpignan, France. We put in all this work to get set up there, and just because the immigration office in that city in France was garbage. Should I say it was corrupt? Should I say it was incompetent? Should I use other more colorful words? Because of a couple bad people in one government bureaucratic office, it was impossible for us to stay there. So that was a paperwork created situation. There were bad people in positions of authority in one office in the government in France, and we did formally complain. I mean, we're highly educated, highly literate people. We saw to what extent we could fight the system. And then it was very clear that because these few people in this one bureaucratic office in France were terrible people and running a terrible office, it was like, well, either we have to exit France completely and then re-enter France and restart the immigration process with new paperwork, like pretend we never arrived in France at all, pretend we didn't just give birth to a baby in France. Start with new paperwork in a different city, in a different province in France. You could do that. That was allowed. That wouldn't be breaking the law. That's the law. You can restart with a new sheet of paper. Or we leave France entirely. We give up on France is the plan. If you've been in one city in France where the immigration process was incompetent, corrupt, bad, etc., why would you think it would be better elsewhere? Remember, when you have to move everything you own by airplane, and everything you own includes a newborn infant, you own almost nothing. Because you have the baby, you have the diapers for the baby, you have all the things you need for the baby. I mean, you know, I didn't own a single book. You know what I mean? I lost everything. I had my own, you know, can't even bring many adult clothes. Your very limited luggage allowance is devoted entirely to the baby and the things the baby needs first and foremost, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, we'd already gone through that, in effect, going from Canada to Perpignan. We worked really hard to create a home out of nothing in Perpignan. You know, rent an empty apartment, furnish it. And in France, it is very hard to get the electricity and lights set up and phone. That was a big struggle in France. Some countries it's easier than others. You know, it is what it is. And then we were losing all that, and we were leaving like refugees. And the question is, well, if we're going to leave like refugees, do you want to come back to France and do this all over again? Or do you want to give up on France entirely?
There's really more than one story that gets buried here. A story that's rather difficult to unearth, you might say. For my entire adult life, I did not want to live in Canada if I was not connected to First Nations languages, Indigenous Canadian languages. By the same token that I wouldn't live in Cambodia if I wasn't actively studying and learning Cambodian or some other Indigenous language of Cambodia, by the same token whereby I didn't want to live in Laos, a country in Southeast Asia, if I wasn't learning Laotian or studying other Indigenous minority languages in Laos, I did not want to be part of the Canadian genocide. And I lived outside of Canada for many, many years as an adult. I mean, when I made the decision to become a scholar of Buddhism, when I made the decision not to be working on First Nations languages, I went and lived in Asia, where there's a tradition and history of those languages. And I was always really clear with my ex-wife, you know, at the time when I was married to her, at the time we were together, you know, if I'm going to live in Canada, then I'm going to work on the Indigenous languages and the Indigenous people's political struggles one way or another, whether that's through the Board of Education or something else. My point being here, not all political struggles involve waving flags in the streets. You can have really meaningful political struggles that are at the Board of Education. You can have meaningful political struggles that go on, you know, in the back of a restaurant. There are different ways to struggle to make the world a better place. But in any case, for me, there was first and foremost this issue of being a white English-speaking Canadian, part of a genocidal colonial history and regime. And, you know, the question I ask, as I put it on this YouTube channel, is, you know, if not you, then who? So at that time, in terms of who I was a former scholar of Buddhism, giving up on Buddhist scholarship and moving back to Canada, married to a cultural anthropologist who worked on Indigenous minority languages in Yunnan. I had been working on Indigenous minority languages and peoples in Laos, Cambodia, Yunnan. Not the only thing I was doing, not even the main thing I was doing, but one of my research interests was in that field. So, okay, the two of us as a couple, me and my ex-wife, moving back to Canada, if not you, then who? It's fair to say not everyone can learn Mohawk, not everyone can learn Ojibwe, not everyone can learn, you know, Nahiawewen, whatever you want to say. You can list off these languages. Not everyone can learn Inuit, you know. Not everyone. But if not you, then who? When you look in the mirror, I mean, if you're a professional PhD in cultural anthropology, that's who my ex-wife is. You're coming back, you're working on Indigenous peoples and minority languages. Okay, if you're, you know, a white vegan who cares about ecology and history and politics, and you've been working on Indigenous languages, minority languages issues, and language education issues in Southeast Asia, when you come back to Canada, I think the dotted line of responsibility is set out for you. You know, it's very clear. Now, there are other interesting positive things you can do with your brain. I would not ridicule someone for wanting to learn sign language to speak with, you know, the deaf. The thing is, the deaf are not the Indigenous people of Canada. The primary political absurdity of 21st century Canada is not reconciling the relationship between the hearing and the deaf. And especially if you live in Saskatchewan, Canada, which is where we were moving to, me and my ex-wife, the primary political struggle very much is reconciling the reality of the white European colonial settler civilization with the indigenous people and what happens next. So I think that was the correct judgment at the time, right? So, I mean, the most fundamental reason why my daughter does not have a Canadian passport, I've said this to my ex-wife more recently, I said it way back before we had a kid, and I said during the birth and raising of my daughter was, no. If this doesn't work out, if I can't stay here and work on Cree or Ojibwe or Mohawk, if I'm not working on one of the indigenous languages, if I'm not positively engaged with this political problem one way or another, then I'm not staying here, and my daughter is not going to have a Canadian passport. So it was a very conscious and intentional decision I made, and still to this day, I am in a sense proud to say that my daughter does not have a Canadian passport. My daughter, the plan was, therefore, after the whole situation fell apart in Saskatchewan, after it became impossible for me to continue with Cree and Ojibwe as languages because of decisions my ex-wife made, the decision was that she would be raised with French, Chinese, and English in that order as her languages of scholarship growing up in France. I don't know, babe. Any comment? I mean, how exhausting was assembling this three-dimensional marble puzzle this morning?
The book. You really need the book to assemble that.
That is true. But once you get the knack down, once you learn which pieces fit with which pieces, you wouldn't need the book. But when you're first doing it, snapping together the various slides and chutes and so on that the marble is supposed to go down. Yeah. So look. That's it. I'm going to see my daughter in France, and thus you guys will not see me on YouTube for a little while. Alexander, if you're watching this video in the year 2025, maybe you have some vague memory of these toys, of the bicycle I sent you when you were living in France and I was living in Canada. It is what it is. When I remember my toys from my childhood, but do I remember who gave them to me? No.